Give me just a moment. Okay. Sorry. Let me start over. I'm going to try to put the election in a deeper context today. And I did a little bit of that last week as well, where I suggested that there are two main forces shaping the dynamics of the contest between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden, and that they are first and foremost the pandemic, and secondly, the economic impact of the pandemic. And that neither of these forces at present favors the president. And of course, time is all but up in this election, right? So we have just really 10 days left. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone because I am getting a little bit of background noise. Please remember that all you need to do, there, that's better, right? All you need to do to unmute yourself is to hit your space bar, and that whenever you want to, you can do that. No need to wait for me to pause for questions. I'll also just mention with apologies that there is some construction going on in my house. I hope the background noise isn't too bad. Please tell me if it's interfering. I'm not exactly sure what I can do, but I can try to keep it down a little bit. So last week I suggested to you that the election is being shaped by the pandemic and the economy, that these forces favor Joe Biden over the president because the majority of Americans do not approve of the way in which the president has handled the pandemic and are currently quite concerned about the economy. And one of the interesting things to note is that recently, this was one of the president's few strengths, but the polling numbers have shifted. And it's actually the case that the electorate appears to give Joe Biden higher marks in terms of their trust for his stewardship of the economy, right? And then I suggested to you, not only is the underlying issue set not favorable to the president, but the fact that the virus appears to be making a resurgence. And I won't go into that in detail this week, but I will urge you to continue to be cautious. As you are, I'm sure, aware, we are nearing, well, we're very close to peak levels or record levels of viral transmission right now. And so it's in one respect, it's getting to be as bad as it's been so far during the pandemic in this country. In another respect, not as bad. The fatalities are not as high. The rates of hospitalization are not quite as high. That probably means that some of this does reflect that we are doing more testing and so getting more information, so we are catching more of the cases. But it certainly does appear that the virus is coming back, and that Americans are obviously not happy about the fact that more than half a year into the pandemic, it doesn't appear that we are any more successful at containing the spread of this virus than we were at the outset. And so that's issue number one. Issue number two is the economy, where I tried to show you with data last week, the CARES Act, which had significant benefits for unemployment, which expired in late July, had a substantial impact in keeping Americans out of poverty, but that since its expiration, more than 8 million new Americans have entered poverty, that savings have dwindled, that people are experiencing more and more economic stress. And so nothing in the intervening week has changed either of those trends. And I'm now going to look at the election from a different angle. And that's primarily the angle of demographics. So what's happening in terms of the changes in the population of the United States, and how does that affect what's happening in the national elections this year? So that's the focus for today's lecture. And let me jump right in by giving you an overview of what's happening in electoral dynamics. Right, next time we meet, we will be just really on the eve of the election. So this is, in a sense, the final chance for me to give you this kind of overview while it's still more prospective. Again, this is largely unchanged. Maybe Biden's doing 1 point better, Trump doing 1 point worse than when we discussed this last week. Again, this is the 538 electoral model. It's based primarily on state level polling data, but also on underlying trends with the virus, with the economy, with issues that are shaping the election. And so don't need to dwell on that, but as you can see, Biden has a near 90% chance of victory according to this model. And again, where the action really is at the state level. If you compare this with what you saw a week ago, you may note that Georgia was blue a week ago and is light red this week. Actually, when you look at that, Georgia is completely a toss-up. I think both Biden and the president are polling at around 49.6% of the vote. It doesn't get really any closer than that. But as I've tried to explain in past weeks, where things really matter for this election, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, right? Those key Midwestern states that Trump took in 2016, Biden has substantial polling leads in all of those states. And so the reason that he's favored to win the election at 87% chance of winning is because of the solid lead that he's opened in those states. And please note, he's up by 4 or 5 points in places like Florida and Arizona, North Carolina. And a couple of the things besides the debate that you may have noticed in the last week's election news. One of them is that the Trump campaign has a surprising cash flow issue. And I want to be careful here. There are two metrics in which to judge the health of the coffers of a campaign. One of them is historical. And by historical margins, Trump looks fine, right? He's got as much or more than he had in 2016, and more than most presidential candidates have had at this point in a presidential race. But the other way to look at this is at what the competition is doing, right? And so if the competition isn't last election or previous elections, but the current election and your opponent, then Trump is not doing great, right? The Biden campaign has more than twice the cash on hand as the Trump campaign and is buying heavily in media markets at the same time that Trump is actually scaling back his media operations. And so that's one thing that's been in the news in the last week about the kind of nuts and bolts of the campaign. The other thing that you may have noticed is that Donald Trump campaigned in Georgia and that he campaigned in Arizona, and that his emerging campaign schedule indicates that he will be going back to some of these states that have been solidly Republican states in presidential elections for roughly the last 20 years, and that Trump really should be able to take for granted at this point in the electoral cycle, should not be concentrating his resources there, which suggests that his campaign is playing defense as opposed to offense at this point. Obviously, Trump and Biden will be extremely focused on Pennsylvania. We saw a little bit of that in last night's debate. If we look at the overall trend, the race has perhaps stabilized at this point. And I pointed out to you in the past that from September through the middle of October, Biden opened up a sizable lead over Trump And one of the things that's interesting and perhaps unexpected is that that lead continued to grow all the way through the middle of October. At this point, the lead is apparently not growing. In a sense, there's not much upward trajectory for it to go. And so I won't go into the details of this, but the people who write about this write about the elasticity and inelasticity, right? You know, when you think of an elastic waistband, it stretches. When something doesn't have elastic, it doesn't stretch, right? Is there room for the electorate to move or not? And they look at that at the state by state level. And there are states, and we can go back here, right? Like, for instance, Oklahoma or North Dakota or Arkansas, where the people who are Republican, and then that's what we're going to focus on for the current scenario, the people who tend to vote Republican in presidential elections, do it in part because it's deeply integrated into their not only political, but also religious identities, right? They are mainly white evangelical Christians. And that tends to be, in the terminology I've just used, quite inelastic, right? It really doesn't matter who the current pope is. If you're Catholic, you are going to remain Catholic. That's your identity, right? You may not be happy with some of the positions the current pope takes, but that doesn't mean you're going to change your religion as a result. And so when we look at the fact that this race is stabilized, but that it's stabilized at such a large probability of a Biden victory, that indicates that most of the elasticity, most of the people who could be convinced have been convinced, and it's strongly trending in Biden's direction. That doesn't mean that Biden's secured of a victory. It is entirely possible still that Trump can win. What it does mean is that, in a sense, at this point in the race, as far as we can tell from the polls, Biden has persuaded almost everybody who is persuadable to vote for him. And so the question is, do the people who never could have been persuaded to vote for Joe Biden, the diehard supporters of Donald Trump, do they turn out in such numbers that they overwhelm Biden's advantage? And that is a possibility, a roughly 1 in 10 possibility. And there is some indication that Trump has done very well in registering new voters and may have a good ground game, that is to say, a good capacity to turn those voters out. But having said all of that, the polls that we're looking at try to take that into account. So in a sense, one of the questions is, how well are they taking that into account? And depending upon the answer to that question, we can be more or less confident in the data I'm showing you right now. Let's look at this for a moment in terms of electoral college outcomes. If we, as we've done in the past, give every state to Biden where he leads by 3 or more points, he has a fairly comfortable electoral college victory. And then we've got this territory of states that we'll call too close to call. But nevertheless, even if Trump wins all of them, it doesn't get him close to an electoral college victory. He has to move some of the states where Biden currently has a polling lead that is 3 or more. And when we look over here, we can see where those states are, right? Florida, Iowa, North Carolina, Georgia, right, are, I'm sorry, that's the 3 threshold, right? And then we get up to the 4 to 6 territory. We're talking about a congressional district in Nebraska, because Nebraska separates its electors for the Electoral College. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Maine, right? Those are the states that are currently solidly in the Biden column that would have to move in the Trump column. If we just gave every state where one or the other candidate is ahead to the 2 candidates right now, assume that the polls actually do reflect or predict electoral outcomes, then as you can see, Biden would win a substantial, you might even call it a landslide victory. Now, if the polls were off by as far as they were in 2016, when there was a substantial bias against now President Trump, Biden would win a narrow victory. And please note that's narrowed a little bit from last week due to some of the trends happening at the state level, due to some of the tightening of the race at the state level. All right, so let me then begin to talk a little bit about the other big news of the week. And obviously this just occurred last night. There was a presidential debate, and it was a much less disappointing affair than the previous debate, which is, as some people say, the bar was set very close to the floor because of how bad the previous debate was. In this debate, there was much less interrupting, much less haranguing, more focus on issues, more sustained discussion of the issues. But all of that is comparative. That does not mean, and I think if you were to look back on, for instance, a debate between Barack Obama and John McCain, you would see how bad these debates are in terms of their content, their focus on the issue, the civility of the discourse between the candidates. Having said all of that, last night was a better debate. And it was not a debate, it appears, in which either of the candidates had a major problem, right? Something that would change the minds of their supporters. But probably Donald Trump actually needed much more than that to alter the dynamics of the race. And as we can see in the instant or snap polls that were done after the debate, basically all of them show that the people who watched the debate came away with the impression that Joe Biden won the debate. And I will just focus for a moment on two aspects of the debate. One of them was the president's continued maintenance of the position that the virus is getting better. And again, I think one of the things that the president has run up against in this election, he has had a strong capacity throughout his career, not only as a politician, but also as a reality TV star, and before that as a real estate developer, to shape perceptions. And he is trying to shape our perception of the pandemic to suggest that it's not that bad and getting better. And the problem is that there's a sharp discrepancy between what the president is trying to get us to believe and what we're seeing as our daily experience of living with the coronavirus. And that this kind of issue, right, a life and death issue, an issue that impacts you in the register that you care most about, your health, your longevity, your capacity to see your relatives, to go about your life as normal, to send your kids to school, to go to work, to maintain your job. It's harder to bend reality, to spin the perception of the reality when it impacts people in that direct a way in terms of their lived experiences. The other thing that I want to point out very quickly, and so, right, Donald Trump continued to try to convince us that the coronavirus is not that bad and getting better. I don't think that that succeeded. I think that's part of what we're seeing here. The other thing, and it's more subtle, but I think it's revealing, is that Donald Trump also suggested that essentially, this is the closing question, what would you say to voters who didn't vote for you? That the success of the economy in his first 3 years as president was bringing people together. And that if you give him another 4 years, that he will restore that success and that will continue to unify us. And he spoke a fair bit about 401ks, which of course are retirement investment accounts, and that they would be a disaster under Joe Biden because the stock market would plummet and 401ks are invested in the stock market. And I would just suggest to you that there's a problem with this overall framework, that overall economic growth is bringing us together, and that the wealth represented by people's retirement investment accounts is a good proxy for the overall economic health of the country. And I don't think either of those propositions holds up. And I'm putting it in, kind of social science wonky speak, but that the lived experience again of most Americans is that the stock market can grow, the economy can grow, and it doesn't mean that their situation is getting better. And on both of these issues, the coronavirus and the unfairness of the distribution of the benefits of economic growth, I think Joe Biden is pitching a line that resonates better with many Americans' lived experiences. And so the reason that we're not seeing Trump doing dramatically better in this polling data about who won the debate, despite the fact that he put in a much better performance. He seemed more presidential, less combative, less of a bully, less raucous, less unfocused. And please note that he continued to peddle this obviously false line. I shouldn't say obviously false. Let me retract and revise. This highly dubious line about Hunter Biden and Russian and Chinese profiteering and Joe Biden's corruption. And I say highly dubious as opposed to obviously false because we don't have the information to confirm or disconfirm this story at present. But it has all the hallmarks of disinformation. The fact that it can't be and hasn't been credibly verified despite essentially 3 years of scrutiny of Joe and Hunter Biden on this issue, that it emerges in the final weeks of a presidential campaign from highly dubious sources and is then transmitted via Rudy Giuliani to Fox News. All of this seems to, if you will, smell bad in terms of verifiability, lead us to believe that this is not reliable information. And perhaps Donald Trump doesn't feel that he's got any other path to victory other than undermining the credibility of Joe Biden, suggesting that he's corrupt. I thought that the more effective attack line was to say, you've been in power for an awful long time. You were vice president and senator. Why didn't you do any of this stuff when you were in power last? That's an indication that Biden would not be an effective president. That might be more effective as an attack line, I think, than corruption. Now, I've pointed out to you that overall, there's a shift in the electorate in the direction of Joe Biden, and this is part of why it is that Joe Biden is so ahead of the polls. But I want to spend more time on this today. And so what I'm going to do today is offer not just this general overview, which is to say that there were people who switched from Obama to Trump who are switching back to Biden in 2020, right? That there are people who had voted Democratic, who voted for a minor party candidate instead, who are switching back to Biden. There were people who didn't vote in 2016, who are indicating in the polls that they will vote for Biden. And this is accounting for the margin of the lead that we're seeing in the polls for Joe Biden in 2020. But I want to, before I get into the demographics, spend just a moment on the Senate as well. And of course, assuming that the polls are right and that Joe Biden does win the presidency, and note, right, that's about an 85-90% probability. It's certainly not guaranteed at this point. But the success of his presidency will clearly depend on whether or not the Democrats also are able to capture the Senate. And so, again, this is a 538 model. And what they show is that at this point, they think the Democrats have about a 3/4 chance, 75% chance of taking the Senate. And again, I think that the direction in this since September 1st, where it was much closer, right, is quite remarkable. And again, I think this reflects the downward drag that Donald Trump is placing on Republican Senate candidates throughout the country, and the fact that Donald Trump has demanded a great deal of loyalty from senators, and or else threatened to punish them, so that the candidates for the Senate are strongly associated with Donald Trump and his politics. And so if we look at the average seats controlled by party, the prediction is right now that the Democrats may have 52 seats. Of course, if Biden wins, they will also have a 53rd vote. If there is ever a tie, Kamala Harris will cast that tie-breaking vote. And so if we look at this at the state by state level, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's a lot of data, but what we see is in Iowa, things are slightly favoring the Democrats. That would be a flip. In Georgia, they're very tight. In North Carolina, another possible flip, right? And then in Maine, it appears an increasingly likely flip that Susan Collins may lose her seat. In Arizona, an increasingly likely flip as well, right? And there are other places that it appears that there's a decent chance that the Democrats may pick up a seat. They're likely to lose a seat in Alabama. So all of this suggests that the Democrats may get 52 seats in the Senate if, again, the polls are accurate in predicting how things are going to turn out. And please note, as I've noted before, this is actually an election cycle that in important respects favored the Republicans, right? And so this speaks to the degree of the shift in the electorate produced by the coronavirus, the economic collapse, and Donald Trump's perceived failures in handling those twin crises. So now getting into the demographics, let me start with this, and this is something I've shared with you before, and this is a striking fact about electoral politics in the United States right now, which is to say, for the presidency, the outcome is determined not by the popular vote, but instead by the Electoral College vote. And this is a calculus done by Nate Silver of 538, suggesting that in order for the Democrats to actually win, for Joe Biden to win, if he wins 2 to 3 percentage points in the popular vote, right? He gets millions more votes than Donald Trump. Nevertheless, he's got a less than 50% chance of winning the election. And this is in part about the way in which the electorate is distributed across states, right? There are many millions of voters in California, just hundreds of thousands in Wyoming. And the likelihood is that millions more will vote for Biden than Trump in California, but that's going to make no difference to the Electoral College votes that Biden wins, right? So he could win California by 1 vote and get all its electoral college votes, or win California by 4 million votes and get all its electoral college votes. That affects the popular vote total, obviously, right? 4 million more votes in one state, but it has no bearing on the electoral college outcome. And so that's why Biden really has to win by at least 4 percentage points, the popular vote, to have a sizable chance at winning, 75% chance at winning. Please note that when you get up to 4 to 5 percentage points, he gets close to an 89% chance of winning. That's where we are in terms of the electoral college math. Please note that right now, Biden's popular vote lead is in the 9% territory. According to this model, that should push him up to around a 99% chance of winning. That's actually not happening yet. And so perhaps this is even, there's even a stronger discrepancy between the electoral college and the popular vote. And that's what I really want to drill down on today, and to show the way in which our constitutional machinery is changing the outcomes of our politics in ways that present the question of how well representative democracy is working in the United States, if by representative democracy we mean an electoral mechanism that translates electoral majorities into majorities in the institutions of decision making, especially the legislature and the executive. And so to begin with, we can see 2 things about the electoral college. One of them is that it strongly magnifies the power of the less populous states. And so this map looks at population per electoral vote, right? And so one way of thinking about this is, if the electors in the electoral college are the representatives of the state in the election that determines the outcome of the presidency, right? How many people per elector? And what you can see is that in California, it's more than 500,000 people per elector. But in Wyoming, right, comparing the most and the least populous state, it is fewer than 140,000 people per elector. There's another way of visualizing this. This kind of color codes it. This does it by size. And please note, right, the discrepancy between California and Wyoming again, right? If you look at California in terms of the size of its power per vote, Wyoming is actually much more powerful. We could do this another way, right, which is to look at North Dakota and Texas, right, 2 conservative states, one of which becomes much more powerful, or even DC and Texas, right, where DC has a much higher level of representation in the electoral college per person than does Texas or Louisiana. But generally speaking, the overall dynamic here is that these relatively less populous Midwestern states and Western states are more represented, have more electoral impact per person than do the coastal states. Look at the way in which California, Oregon, Washington are shrunk in terms of their electoral power, and look at what happens to Massachusetts and New York, right? Absolutely compressed in terms of their impact. New York, by the way, is over here, right? It's almost hard to find because it's so small in terms of its electoral impact. Florida is also diminished. And so once we begin to think about the fact that the Electoral College gives more power to certain states than others, we can begin to ask, what are the demographics in those states? And what we can see is that the states that get more power have more white non-college educated voters, right? And so this is the dark blue, the voting eligible population as a whole, and then it's weighted in terms of the state level, right? And so this is the degree to which white non-college educated voters have their power amplified by the Electoral College. That's because more white non-college educated voters live in those less populous states, and so they get more electors per person than the people who live in the coastal states or the more densely populated states. So when we look at white college grads, they're slightly overrepresented, right? And so white people as a whole are more represented in the Electoral College, or their power is amplified by the Electoral College, and especially the less educated whites. If we look at Hispanics with non-college degree, they are underrepresented. They're concentrated in states like California and Florida and New York that are underrepresented. If we look at Hispanics with college degrees, they're underrepresented. Blacks with non-college degrees and Blacks with college degrees are underrepresented. Again, this has to do with the distribution of these demographic groups across states, right? And so this is the way the Constitution works. And these are some of the, I would say, perverse unintended consequences of the way in which the Constitution works in the 21st century as we become a more diverse country and as we become more skewed in terms of our population distribution to the coastal and southern states. I won't drill down on Asians, but as you can see, that they are also somewhat underrepresented in the Electoral College. Now we can look at this in yet another light, and that is to look at political geography, where people live and how that affects their representation. And the interesting thing here is that the United States is really quite evenly divided, right? You can see urban and rural, we split 25%, 25%. That's shifting, but right now it's basically an even divide. What is more, I think, revealing is that 27% of the population lives in suburban areas and 23% in ex-urban areas. And I hope that language is clear, but you can think of this in terms of concentric circles drawn around an urban area. The urban area is the city itself with high population density. The suburban area is the immediate ring surrounding that city, where we are right now in Westchester County, New York, counts as a suburban area. We can then think about exurbs as being the next ring out, right? So less population density, further away from the city, but not agrarian, not rural, right? Still people who often commute into the city to work, but have fewer neighbors, have to go farther to get there. Now, when we look at representation, look at the discrepancy between urban population and urban representation, right? The urban vote is diminished by more than 30%, right? And on the other hand, the rural vote is amplified or exaggerated by more than 30%. And so again, the geography here is an independent variable, but it's in part also overlapping with race. Finally, looking at the Senate, and as opposed to looking just at the overall representation in the Electoral College, we can see this represented much more starkly. And so this is a diagram here of the senators who represent 1/4 of the people in the United States. Note that that is 62 senators representing 25% of the population. That means essentially that the majority of the Senate is elected by 1/4 of the population. Whereas these 6 senators, right? And as you can see, that's Texas, California, and Florida, also represent 25% of the population of the United States. That's a huge skew when you look at it this way. This many people representing the same population as this many people. That's a 10-to-1 ratio of power amplification. And the result of all of this is that the Senate is more conservative than the United States as a whole. The Senate is in terms of its ideological makeup between +5 and +10 in terms of being more Republican. I won't get into the methodology of how this is calculated, but I hope you will basically trust on the basis of what you see in terms of voting patterns in the Senate, most notably on display this week with what's happening with the confirmation hearing of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, whereas the US population as a whole is here, right? So the Senate skews ideologically. It amplifies the power of the more conservative, white, less educated portions of the US population. And this is true also of the Electoral College. And so when we translate this into electoral math at the Electoral College level, right, the skew is about 1.5%, right? That it shifts the electoral outcomes by about 1.5%. At the House level, due to gerrymandering, it's shifted about 2.3%. At the Senate level, about 3%, which is to say, for the Democrats to win at the Electoral College level, they have to at least get 1.5% more than of the popular vote than 50%, right? Unless that happens, it's almost inconceivable. To gain the House, they have to get 2.3% more. To gain the Senate, they have to get 3% more of the national vote. Now, having said all of that, and I hope you find this disturbing, alarming, right? Which is to say that the constitutional machinery of the United States combined with gerrymandering is amplifying the power of a non-representative minority. It's amplifying the power of the less populous states, which are almost by definition more rural, but it also turns out whiter, less well-educated, more conservative, and that is dictating the politics of the United States. This is sometimes referred to as minoritarian rule, which is to say that a minority of the population has the majority of the power and is doing things that the majority objects to. And on its face, that seems to be problematic from a democratic point of view. Here is the good news, and this is what I will conclude the lecture with today. The demographic trends are changing. And so let's start with the overall demographic trends. And part of what I've emphasized is that these white voters without a college degree are overrepresented in the less populous states, and they've been extremely important to Donald Trump's electoral success. These are the people who carried him across the line in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, right? And they are declining as a share of the population. And as you can see, they continue to decline from 2016 to 2018. White college voters with a college degree are actually increasing as a portion of the population. If we look at the long-term trend, more and more people are getting college degrees. And so whereas in 1976, they were 17% of the population, they're now 34% of the population, doubled, right? These people tend to vote Democratic. It's not uniform, but it is a tendency. These people tend to vote Republican. Especially in the Donald Trump era, again, 71% of the population in 1976, now 39% of the population. And here's the other big trend, right? Minority voters, non-white voters, people of color, African Americans, Asians, Latinos, 11% of the population in 1976, now 27% of the population. So more than doubled as a portion of the population. And I will point out to you that part of what is perhaps driving white voters without a college degree to support a populist politician and nationalist politician like Donald Trump is precisely the fact that this share of the population is growing, that a disproportionate share of wealth and income is going to this share, and this group feels the white voters without a college degree left out, ignored, endangered. They are insecure, right? And Trump, in a sense, played on that insecurity to secure his electoral victory. But the people who are susceptible to being mobilized in that way are a shrinking portion of the population, and the growing portions of the population are less likely to support that kind of politics. So if we now look at this in 2018 and note what changed from 2016, right? We see actually, I'm sorry, from 2014, a remarkable uptick in the voting behavior of white voters without a college degree. This is why Donald Trump won the presidency. He correctly detected that this population could be mobilized, could be brought out to vote, that they were underrepresented in the electorate. This is what the pollsters missed in 2016, what Hillary Clinton's campaign missed in 2016. And so you see a 10% uptick in the voting of the population of white people without a college degree. But what you are seeing now, and note that this is 2018, not 2016, is also a sharp uptick in voters, white voters with college degrees and minority voters. And to put this starkly, Donald Trump is mobilizing the electorate as a whole, not only the people who support him, but also the people who oppose him. And in a sense, this is the electoral conundrum for Donald Trump. What he does to mobilize his own base also tends to mobilize the opposition. And so he produces not only support, but opposition, countervailing pressures. And you can see this very clearly in the movement with minority voters increasing their vote, white voters with a college degree increasing their vote in the Trump era. Now, looking at how this is playing out in 2020, what you see here is that Trump continues to be heavily favored by white voters with no college degree, 55 to 35%. He's not doing as well as he was doing in 2016. Biden is better at appealing to these voters, but he still has a substantial lead. But when we look at white voters with college degrees, right, Trump is trailing. And when we look at Hispanic voters and other minority voters, he's trailing substantially. So we put this together with the demographic trends, and what you can see is that things are becoming more difficult for the president, that the way in which the Electoral College or the Senate amplifies the power of white, less well-educated, rural, more conservative voters is being offset by demographic trends. And where we really need to concentrate is in the key battleground states. And as you can see, when we look at Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, the trends that we're talking about nationally are playing out in these states as well, to varying degrees, right? In Pennsylvania, the growth of minority voters is less pronounced, but the growth of white voters with a college degree is more pronounced. When we look at Michigan, the trends are more muted. When we look at Georgia, much stronger growth in minority voters. Same is true in Florida, same is true in Arizona. We've got to look at this state by state. But what you see is if you concentrate on that mustard band, right, the band of white voters with no college degrees, they are being pushed down in most of these states, not so much in Michigan, but in almost every other state, and being pushed down from 2016 to 2018. These trends, we don't have the data yet, the census hasn't been conducted, but they're likely to continue into 2020. And so again, this counteracts some of the demographic advantages that the president had in 2016. And so finally, if we look at this in terms of purely demographic terms, and I want to be clear, this is not a prediction about the election. What matters is not only what the demographics of the state are, but of course, how the people within those demographic groups vote. And there are two things, right? Are there a certain number of minority voters that vote for Trump? Are there a certain number of non-college degree whites who vote for Biden? Those things do seem to be happening, right? And they're in a sense counteracting trends. But if we look at the general idea, right, that white non-college voters are strongly inclined to vote for Trump, that the white college educated voters and the voters of color are much more inclined to vote for Biden. How have those two groups shifted from 2016 to 2020? And what you can see is that the Trump coalition has declined in every state except for Arizona in those 4 years, and that the Biden coalition has grown in every one of these swing states. And so these demographic factors matter. And they matter especially in light of the way in which the institutional machinery of the Constitution represents these states, right? And these are mainly less populous states, more rural states, Midwestern states. And this is where the election is going to be determined. So final piece of demographic data, and this is about age, right? And so the baby boom, or the people who are born in the immediate aftermath of World War II through the middle 1960s, silent and older is the group who was born before the end of World War II, Generation X, born after 1965, before the turning of the new millennium, millennials born around the late 90s into the early 2000s, Generation Z, people who were born in the last 20 years, right? Or I should say the last 15 years, I'm sorry. And what you can see again is that the older voters are shrinking as a share of the population. The younger voters are growing. This is a natural demographic turnover in the population. But what we know is that the younger voters are more likely to vote Democratic and are especially repelled by the racial politics of the Trump administration, the anti-immigration politics of the Trump administration, that on those issues, the younger voters tend to be quite a bit more liberal than the older voters. And so all of that to say, looking at it from this final demographic lens, and I'll stop there, leave a little bit of time for conversation, there's another reason to believe that the electoral math for Donald Trump is less favorable in 2020 than it was in 2016. And that is despite the fact that the way in which electoral institutions operate magnifies the power of his natural supporters. All right, I know I just threw a lot of information at you. Who would like to start us out with a question or a comment? I know. So, I'm sorry, unmute everyone. And so beware, your background noise is now going to be picked up. Who wants to start us out? Thoughts about the debate, thoughts about the final phases of the campaign, what's happening with the nomination of Judge Barrett to the Supreme Court, or about the stuff I just spoke with you about in terms of the way in which less populous states get more power in the United States, or the demographic changes in the electorate as a whole. Lots of stuff. Who wants to start us? Go ahead.
Were we as sure about Trump, about Hillary Clinton winning in 2016 as we are today about Biden winning? Did any of the figures show anything? That's about all I wanted to ask you. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, no, I completely understand what you're saying. And let me call your attention to a diagram that I believe should help with this. So yes, we entered the election in 2016 feeling that Hillary Clinton had a clear advantage, and we were surprised by what we found the night of the election and the next day, right? Is there a likelihood that that's going to happen again? And so if you look at this diagram, and I think this is particularly important, right? So the polls were off by about 3 percentage points in 2016, right? And they therefore undercounted Trump, overcounted Clinton by about 3 percentage points. So if we were to subtract 3 percentage points from Biden's overall lead, he would go from 9 to 6, right? And note in each of the states, right, there's the possibility that, for instance, Wisconsin, where there was a significant polling mistake in 2016, would tilt over into the Trump column if the polls were as far off in 2016. But the other thing that this diagram does is it points out to you that in 2012, the polls were off in the opposite direction, right? They were actually more favorable to Mitt Romney than they were to Barack Obama. And part of the reason that the person who prepares this diagram keeps both of those columns there is to point out to you that there's a tendency in pollsters to overcorrect, right? They made mistakes that underestimated the Democrats' vote in 2012, so they made mistakes that overestimated the Democrats' vote in 2016. If they've overcorrected again, we might see the opposite kind of polling error, which is to say that the polls are undercounting Biden's support. But even if the polls are as biased as they were in 2016, or as flawed, as mistaken, biased might not be the right term there, it's still the case that Biden is looking pretty good in states that would be sufficient to get him a narrow electoral college victory. So yes, it's possible. Can you give me maybe 2 more minutes and I'll be done with my class? Thank you. Sorry, I've got work going on in the house and they want to talk with me. So does that begin to answer the question? Yes, polls make mistakes. Yes, sometimes they all make the same mistakes in the same direction. But the reason they made the mistakes in 2016 is that they undercounted, in particular, the rate at which less well-educated people would vote, because Trump actually motivated those people to vote. Part of what I've shown you demographically is that that group is perhaps less impactful in 2020 than they were in 2016. The other thing I would point out to you is that the pollsters learned from their mistakes and they're trying harder to capture those voters. Thank you for the question. Anyone else with the question at this point?
a comment. Trump keeps saying he wants to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, that he's got another plan. Why has he never come up and let us know what his plan is? He really
Doesn't have a plan.
Yeah, somebody just gave the answer that I would give, which is to say that there are two possibilities here. One of them is when you ask somebody repeatedly, what's your plan, what's your plan, what's your plan? And they say, I've got a plan, I've got a plan. And you ask them, well, okay, tell me about it. And they say, oh, it's a great plan. You either suspect that they don't have a plan, right? That they're indicating that they have a plan because they know they're supposed to, but they don't actually. Or else that their plan is one that they don't want to share with you. Maybe they do have a plan, but they suspect if they shared it with you, you wouldn't like it very much. And so the political gambit here is, we've been unable to, and I'm now speaking as a generic Republican who is attacking Obamacare, we've been unable to actually revoke this legislation through Congress, right? It turns out that there aren't enough people willing to vote it out in Congress, right? So let's attack it in the Supreme Court. And then if it gets overturned, there will be no choice but to come up with an alternative plan. And we'll negotiate that issue when that circumstance arises. That's my short answer. Okay, so good conversation today. I hope this was making sense to you. And we will get together again next week. And at that point, we will be just days from the election. Please continue taking care of yourself. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Fun as always to be able to get to spend some time with you today. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.